Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. Christopher Henley had learned to read the silence of Isle Royale the way other men read newspapers. 22 years as a ranger on this isolated spit of rock and forest in Lake Superior had taught him that silence had texture, weight, intention. The morning silence on July 19, 2011 felt wrong in a way he couldn't articulate to Rick Vasquez, the younger ranger riding beside him in the aging Polaris Ranger UTV as they bounced along the rutted service road toward Wendigo. "You're doing that thing again," Rick said, one hand braced against the roll bar. That 1,000-yard stare. Christopher kept his eyes on the dense wall of spruce and birch sliding past. What thing? The thing where you look like you're listening to something nobody else can hear. Rick had worked the island for 3 summers now, long enough to trust Christopher's instincts, but not long enough to understand them. "It's just quiet, man. It's always quiet out here." But it wasn't the same quiet. Christopher had felt this particular quality of stillness only once before, 15 years ago, when his sister Allison had walked into the backcountry of pictured rocks and never walked out. The search teams had found her backpack torn open, contents scattered, one boot half buried in leaves. No body, no blood. Nothing to explain why a careful, experienced hiker would abandon her gear and vanish into 200,000 acres of wilderness. The Motorola radio mounted to the dash crackled. "Ranger Station to Unit 3, come in, Christopher." He lifted the handset. "Unit 3, go ahead, Jenna." "Got your missing person report details. Hannah Whitmore, 19, University of Minnesota, reported overdue by her hiking partner this morning. Last seen yesterday around 1600 hours heading toward the Greenstone Ridge Trail from the Rock Harbor area. Partner says Hannah wasn't feeling well, wanted to rest alone at the Daisy Farm campsite. When she didn't show by sundown, partner assumed she'd camped separately. This morning, tent's there, but Hannah's gone. Sleeping bag too." Christopher felt something shift in his chest, a tightness that had nothing to do with the rough road. "She took her sleeping bag?" "Affirmative, and her pack, but left her boots. Ranger Thompson found them outside the tent." Rick glanced at Christopher, eyebrows raised. People didn't hike Isle Royale's rocky trails barefoot. The island's ancient basalt could slice through skin like broken glass. "We're 20 minutes out," Christopher said. "Tell Thompson to secure the scene. Nobody touches anything." "Copy that. And Christopher?" Jenna's voice dropped, lost some of its professional edge. "This is the 4th one." He knew. Amanda Sykes in May disappeared from the Hatchet Lake area. Only her clothes found folded beside the trail. Marcus Chen in June vanished between Chicken Bone and McCargo Cove. Rangers discovered his camp with food still warming on the camp stove. Sarah Pemberton 3 weeks ago, gone from the Feltman Ridge Trail, left behind a journal with the final entry reading only, "So hungry, can't stop, bones showing through." "I know," Christopher said, and replaced the handset. They drove the rest of the way in silence. Christopher's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, knuckles pale against tanned skin. The morning sun filtered through the canopy in weak, grayish shafts that seemed to generate no warmth. Mid-July in Michigan should have been sweltering, but Christopher's breath misted slightly in the air. Rick noticed. "Temperature's dropping, that's weird, right? It was 75 at the station an hour ago." Christopher said nothing. The cold was wrong, unnatural, the kind that seemed to seep up from the earth itself rather than down from the air. He'd felt it before, that last morning before Allison disappeared, when they'd argued about her solo hike. She'd been acting strange for days, refusing meals, complaining the food didn't satisfy her no matter how much she ate. He'd thought it was stress from graduate school, maybe an eating disorder she was hiding. He'd let her go. The Daisy Farm campsite sat in a small clearing overlooking Lake Superior's gray expanse. The water looked black this morning, almost oily, its surface too smooth. Christopher parked the UTV and walked to where Ranger Mark Thompson stood beside a small blue tent. hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets despite the season. Cold snap came through around 0400, Mark said by way of greeting. Don't know what the hell's going on with the weather. Barometer's going crazy. He was a solid man in his 50s, graying beard, not given to exaggeration. But that's not the weird part. Christopher waited. Mark nodded toward the tent. Take a look inside. I didn't touch anything after I saw it. The tent's flap hung open. Christopher crouched at the entrance, pulling a small mag light from his belt. The interior reeked of something sharp and organic, like copper mixed with spoiled meat. Hannah's sleeping bag lay bunched in the corner, and scattered across the tent floor were dozens of small bones picked completely clean. Squirrel bones, Christopher recognized. Chipmunk. Songbirds. The tiny skull of what might have been a vole, jaw still articulated, eye sockets dark. Jesus, Rick breathed behind him. On the tent's nylon wall, scratched deep enough to tear the fabric in places, were symbols Christopher recognized from his sister's case file, the one he'd memorized during sleepless nights 15 years ago. Spiral patterns, elongated figures with antlers, and Ojibwe syllabics he'd taught himself to read in the desperate years after Allison vanished. Wintiko. Windigo. His mouth went dry. What is that? Rick asked. Graffiti? It's old, Christopher said, his voice steadier than he felt. Ojibwe. Warning symbols. He didn't translate. Didn't say the word that had haunted him since Allison. The word the old Ojibwe man in Grand Portage had whispered to him when Christopher had shown him photos of Allison's last campsite. The man had refused to speak it aloud, had only written it on a piece of paper. Wendigo. Spirit of hunger. Spirit of winter. Spirit of cannibalism and greed. The entity that is always hungry, the old man had said. That transforms those who let the hunger take them. Your sister, you said she was starving herself before she left? Christopher had nodded, not understanding. Not starving. Changing. The Wendigo starts with hunger that cannot be satisfied. Then comes the cold. Then the transformation. The person becomes the thing they feed. Christopher had dismissed it as superstition then, grief making him grasp at explanations. But now, standing in Hannah's abandoned tent surrounded by tiny gnawed bones, feeling winter cold in the middle of July, he felt the certainty settle into his marrow like frost. We need to find her, he said. Now. They found the trail easily enough. Hannah's bare footprints pressed into the soft earth heading northwest, deeper into the island's interior. But the prints were wrong. Too long, too narrow. The spacing between them suggested a stride that shouldn't be possible for someone Hannah's size, and every few yards, scattered beside the footprints, were more bones. Larger now, a rabbit's spine, the rib cage of a young fox. She's moving fast, Mark observed, studying the tracks. 4, maybe 5 miles an hour in bare feet, through this terrain? He shook his head. Doesn't make sense. Christopher checked his Garmin GPS, the Montana 650 unit he'd bought last year. The satellite signal kept flickering, losing lock. Typical for the heavy canopy, but more dramatic than usual. We follow the trail. Rick, radio base camp. Tell them we're pursuing on foot and to have the seaplane on standby. For what? Medical evacuation. If we find her, she's going to need hospitalization. If we find her alive, he didn't add. They moved into the forest following the trail of footprints and bones. The temperature continued to drop. Christopher could see his breath now, great clouds of it forming with each exhalation. Frost was forming on the leaves in July, crystalline patterns that looked almost deliberate in their arrangement. Rick pulled out his digital camera, a Canon Rebel his wife had bought him for Christmas, and documented everything. This is going in the weirdest SAR report I've ever written, he muttered. An hour into the pursuit, they found Hannah's clothes, her shirt first, then her pants, both torn as if removed in haste, her underwear shredded, and with them, more bones. Christopher crouched beside what remained of a snowshoe hare, fur still attached in patches. The skull had been cracked open, brain cavity licked clean. Christopher, Mark's voice was tight. What are we dealing with here? Christopher stood slowly, every joint in his body aching with cold. You worked up in Alaska before Isle Royale, right? You ever hear stories about the Wendigo? Mark's face went carefully blank. You mean the cannibal spirit? The hunger spirit. The thing that makes people into monsters when they consume human flesh. Or when they're consumed by greed, by need, by appetites they can't control. Christopher met Mark's eyes. The Ojibwe who lived on this island, they had stories. They left this place because of something in the forest, something that called to people in winter, made them hungry, made them eat things they shouldn't eat. That's folklore, Mark said, but his voice lacked conviction. 4 people have disappeared, Christopher said. All of them young, all of them healthy. And all of them, according to the reports, experiencing the same symptoms before they vanished. Extreme hunger, hypothermia despite warm weather, behavioral changes. He paused. My sister exhibited the same symptoms before she disappeared 15 years ago. Rick had gone very pale. You think something on this island is, what, infecting people? I think something on this island is calling to people, Christopher said, and when they answer, they change. They pressed on. The forest around them had gone completely silent. No birdsong, no squirrel chatter, nothing but the crunch of their boots on frost-hardened ground. Christopher's fingers were going numb inside his gloves. His teeth wanted to chatter. And beneath the cold, he felt something else. Hunger. Not normal hunger, but something vast and hollow, an emptiness that seemed to originate in his bones themselves, spreading outward like ink in water. He'd felt this before, that morning before Allison left. I need to eat, he said suddenly. We've only been out 2 hours, Rick said. You had breakfast. I know, but the hunger was intensifying, a physical ache that made his stomach clench. He fumbled for the protein bar in his jacket pocket, tore it open, shoved the entire thing in his mouth. It tasted like ash, like nothing, provided no relief. The hunger remained, grew stronger. He pulled out another bar, consumed it. Nothing. Mark was watching him with growing alarm. Christopher, you okay? No. The word came out harsh. I'm not. He forced himself to stop reaching for another bar, to breathe, to think. It's the same thing, the hunger, it's how it starts. How what starts? Christopher didn't answer. He was remembering Allison's final phone call, her voice thin and desperate. I can't stop eating, Chris. I've gone through all my food and it's not enough. Nothing's enough. And I'm so cold. It's July and I'm so cold I can see frost on my tent. She'd laughed, a brittle sound. I think I'm losing my mind. He'd told her to come back, to let him come get her. She'd refused. Said she needed to push through it, that it was just stress, just her mind playing tricks. She'd promised to call back in an hour. She never did. They found Hannah at midday, though the light filtering through the canopy was winter weak, gray and thin. She stood in a small clearing near a frozen creek, frozen in July, her back to them, completely naked. Her skin had taken on a bluish-white cast and she was eating something, tearing at it with her teeth, swallowing without chewing. Hannah? Christopher called. She turned slowly, and Christopher's breath stopped in his lungs. Her eyes had filmed over with a milky cataract, but beneath the cloudiness something moved, something aware and ancient and utterly inhuman. Her lips were black with frostbite, split and bleeding, and the thing she'd been eating, cradled in her hands like a precious gift, was her own left forearm, stripped to the bone from wrist to elbow. Still hungry, she said, her voice distorted, resonating as if multiple voices spoke at once. Always hungry. Forever hungry. Rick made a sound like a wounded animal and stumbled backward. Mark had his service weapon out, hands shaking too badly to aim properly. Hannah smiled, revealing teeth that had grown longer, sharper. You understand, she said, looking directly at Christopher. You feel it too. The hunger, the cold. It called to your blood before. It's calling again. Allison, Christopher whispered. Your sister heard the call. The thing wearing Hannah's body said. She answered. She transformed. She fed. And now she waits in the deep forest, always hungry, always cold, waiting for others to join. The creature took a step forward, bones creaking audibly in the frozen air. You can feel it already, can't you? The emptiness. Food doesn't help. Nothing helps. Because what you hunger for isn't food. Christopher's hand moved to his own service weapon, but his fingers were too numb with cold to unsnap the holster. What do we hunger for? Transformation, Hannah said. To become something beyond human limitation, beyond need, beyond death. Another step forward. Frost spread from her footprints in crystalline patterns. She's been calling to you for years, your sister. Calling through the winter winds, through the hunger in your belly at night, through the cold spots in your house. She wants you to join her, to be family again. That's not possible, Christopher said, but even as he spoke, he was remembering. The nightmares that had plagued him since Allison's disappearance, dreams of wandering through endless frozen forest, always searching for something just out of reach, the way food had lost its appeal gradually over the years, everything tasting faintly wrong. The chronic cold he blamed on poor circulation, the way he wore sweaters even in summer. The Wendigo had been calling to him, and he'd been answering, slowly, incrementally, year by year. No, he said, forcing the word out. I'm not like you. Not yet, Hannah agreed. But soon, the hunger only grows, the cold only deepens, and when you finally transform, when you shed your useless human flesh and become what you were meant to be, you'll understand. You'll thank us. She lunged. Mark fired twice, center mass, the shots impossibly loud in the frozen clearing. Hannah's body jerked with the impacts but didn't fall. Black fluid leaked from the wounds instead of blood, freezing before it hit the ground. She laughed, a sound like cracking ice, and kept coming. Rick was screaming something, but Christopher couldn't hear it over the roaring in his ears. The hunger that had become a physical force trying to drag him forward, trying to make him run toward Hannah instead of away, trying to make him understand that transformation would end the pain, end the emptiness, end everything. He fought it, forced his numb fingers to close around his radio. Base camp, this is Christopher. We need immediate air support at... He fumbled with the GPS unit, coordinates dancing in his vision. At coordinates 47.9945, 88.8573. Medical emergency. Repeat, medical emergency. What kind of emergency? Jenna's voice crackled through the speaker. Christopher watched Hannah tear into Rick's shoulder with her blackened teeth as the younger ranger tried to fend her off with his bare hands, screaming. Watched Mark fire again and again, bullets passing through Hannah's body like she was made of mist and ice. Watched the forest around them grow darker, colder, as if winter itself was pouring into the clearing from some deep reservoir of cold. Unknown biological hazard, Christopher said. Tell them to bring restraints, and tell them... He swallowed, tasted copper and frost. Tell them to quarantine everyone involved, including me. Because he understood now. The Wendigo wasn't just Hannah, wasn't just his sister. It was something older than the island itself, something that lived in the spaces between hunger and satisfaction, between human and monster. It was transformation, inevitable and terrible, and it had been patient, 15 years patient, waiting for him to return to the island, waiting for him to feel the hunger grow strong enough that he couldn't resist. Hannah released Rick, who collapsed, clutching his torn shoulder, blood freezing before it could pool. She turned back to Christopher, still smiling her terrible smile. You can't escape, she said. The hunger doesn't end. It only transforms. Your sister learned. These others learned. And you'll learn too, Christopher. One way or another. Christopher's hand finally found his pistol. He drew it, aimed, but his hands were shaking so violently he couldn't hold the sight picture steady. Not from fear, he realized. From hunger. His body was consuming itself from the inside out, burning through resources at an impossible rate, trying to fuel some fundamental change in his cellular structure. He was transforming. Right now. And there was nothing he could do to stop it. No, he said again. but the word came out in a cloud of frost. From somewhere in the distance came the sound of the seaplane's engine, growing closer. Too late, Christopher thought. Whatever was going to happen would be over before help arrived. Hannah lunged again, impossibly fast, and Christopher fired. Once, twice, 3 times. The first 2 shots went wild, but the third caught her in the throat. She went down, still moving, still reaching for him with hands that ended in fingers, stretched too long, bones showing through translucent flesh. "She's waiting for you," Hannah gurgled, black fluid bubbling from her ruined throat. "In the deep forest, in the cold places. She's been waiting so long. Don't make her wait anymore, Christopher. Let go. Let the hunger take you. Become." Christopher stood over her, pistol aimed at her head, finger tightening on the trigger. 1 shot. That's all it would take? End this. End her suffering. But was she suffering? Her milky eyes looked almost peaceful despite the ruin of her body, as if the transformation had brought some kind of release, some answer to a question he hadn't known he was asking. The hunger in his belly growled, grew teeth. "Christopher, do it!" Mark shouted. He had Rick propped against a tree, applying pressure to the shoulder wound. "Shoot her!" Christopher's finger remained on the trigger, but he couldn't pull it, because if he ended Hannah, he ended the only connection to his sister he had left. The only evidence that Allison still existed in some form, somewhere in these woods. "Please," he whispered, "please tell me where she is." Hannah's smile widened. "Everywhere, nowhere, in every cold wind, in every winter hunger. She's become the forest itself, Christopher, just like I'm becoming, just like you will." The seaplane roared overhead, banking toward the water. Christopher pulled the trigger. Hannah's body went still, frost spreading across her skin like a blanket, covering the wounds, making her look almost peaceful, almost human again. But her eyes remained open, milky and knowing, and Christopher could have sworn he saw his sister looking back at him from behind that clouded gaze. The hunger in his belly twisted, grew stronger, and for just a moment, standing in that frozen clearing in the middle of July, Christopher understood what Hannah had been trying to tell him. The hunger would never end. The cold would never leave. Because he'd been marked 15 years ago, the moment Allison disappeared. The Wendigo had claimed him then, had simply been waiting for him to ripen. And now, surrounded by the bodies of the dead and dying, feeling his own transformation accelerate, Christopher realized that the only question left was how long he could resist. The seaplane's engine grew louder. Help was coming. But Christopher knew, with terrible certainty, that it was already too late. They evacuated him with the others, strapped to a gurney despite his protests that he could walk. The seaplane carried them back to the mainland, to the hospital in Houghton, where doctors ran tests that revealed nothing abnormal. Christopher's temperature was low, but not dangerously so. His blood work showed mild hypoglycemia. The hunger, they said, was likely psychosomatic shock from the traumatic events he'd witnessed. They kept him for observation for 3 days. On the second night, Christopher woke to find frost coating the hospital window, though it was 85 degrees outside. He could see his breath in the air, and in the reflection on the glass standing behind his bed, he saw a figure, thin, tall, antlered. "Allison?" he whispered. The figure didn't respond, but when Christopher turned, the room was empty. Empty except for the cold, which had settled into his bones like an old friend, and the hunger, which had become as familiar as his own heartbeat. Rick survived his injuries, but quit the Park Service immediately, moved back to New Mexico, and refused to discuss what happened in the clearing. Mark stayed on, but requested a transfer to Yellowstone, somewhere warm, somewhere far from water and forest and cold. Christopher returned to Isle Royale. They didn't want to send him back, the administrators. Too traumatic, they said. Take disability leave. See a therapist. He'd been through too much. But Christopher had insisted, and eventually they'd relented. Someone needed to work the island, and he knew it better than anyone. He'd be fine, he told them. Just needed to keep busy. What he didn't tell them was that he needed to go back because the island was calling to him. had been calling since that day in the clearing, a constant whisper at the edge of his hearing. His sister's voice, maybe, or maybe something older, something that wore his sister's shape the way a hand wore a glove. He couldn't eat. Food tasted like cardboard, like ash, like nothing. He'd lost 30 pounds since July, his clothes hanging loose on his frame. The doctors prescribed supplements, appetite stimulants. Nothing helped. The hunger remained, vast and hollow and terrible, but it wasn't hunger for food. It was hunger for transformation, for release, for cold. On his first day back at Isle Royale in late September, when the aspens were turning gold and the temperature dropping toward seasonal norms, Christopher hiked alone into the interior. Officially, he was checking on the campsite where Hannah had been found, gathering evidence for the ongoing investigation. Unofficially, he was listening for his sister's voice. He found the clearing easily, though 3 months had passed and snow had already begun to accumulate. The tent was gone, removed by investigators, but the scratched symbols remained on the trees surrounding the site. Wintico, Windigo, warning, prayer, promise. Christopher stood in the center of the clearing, feeling the cold seep through his jacket, through his skin, into the marrow of his bones. The hunger was stronger here, almost unbearable. His stomach cramped with emptiness that no food could fill. "Allison," he called into the wind. The wind answered, not with words exactly, but with understanding. His sister was here and not here. She was the cold itself, the hunger itself, the transformation that waited at the edge of human endurance. She'd been calling to him for 15 years, and he'd finally come home. Christopher stood in the clearing until sunset, until his lips turned blue and frost formed on his eyebrows. He stood until the hunger became a physical force, until his hands began to shake and his vision tunneled. He stood until he understood, finally, what choice he was being offered. He could leave, could go back to the mainland, resign from the Park Service, move somewhere warm and bright and far from forests. The transformation would stop, maybe. The hunger would fade. He could pretend to be human for the rest of his life, always feeling the cold, always hearing the call but never answering. Or he could stay, could walk deeper into the forest, into the frozen heart of Isle Royale where the old spirit still lingered. Could let the hunger take him, let the transformation complete, become something beyond human limitation. Something that never felt the pain of loss because it was loss, was absence, was the empty space where warmth used to be. Christopher closed his eyes and made his choice. When the search teams found his abandoned ranger station 3 days later, his radio equipment was still on, his coffee still cooling in the mug on his desk. His jacket hung on the peg by the door, his boots sat neatly by the entrance. But Christopher Henley was gone, walked into the forest in his socks, leaving only footprints that grew longer and narrower with each step, spacing wider apart, heading northwest into country no ranger had mapped. The prints disappeared into the deep woods where frost grew even in summer, where the wind carried voices of the lost, where something ancient and patient and forever hungry waited for those willing to answer its call. The official report listed him as another disappearance, another statistic in the island's long history of people walking into the wilderness and never returning. But the rangers who worked Isle Royale after that, they heard stories about a figure seen in the winter woods, tall and thin and crowned with something like antlers, about campers who disappeared from their tents on cold nights, leaving only bones picked clean and strange symbols scratched in the frost, about a voice that called through the wind, speaking names, making promises of release from pain, from hunger, from the burden of being human. And on the coldest nights, when the wind blew hard from the northwest and frost formed impossible patterns on the windows, the rangers would lock their doors and turn up their heaters and try not to think about Christopher Henley or his sister or the thing they'd become together in the frozen heart of the island. Because some hungers, once awakened, could never be satisfied. Some transformations, once begun, could never be stopped. And some calls once heard, echoed forever in the spaces between one heartbeat and the next, waiting for the moment when resistance finally failed and the last boundary between human and monster dissolved like frost under morning sun. On Isle Royale, the Wendigo was patient. It had all the time in the world, and plenty of people still came to the island, hiking alone into the wilderness, unaware that they were walking into territory that hadn't belonged to humans for a very long time. The island waited, cold and hungry, eternal. And in the deep forest where frost grew even in summer, something that had once been Christopher Henley waited too. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened. Daniel Reeves had stopped trusting his own perceptions 3 years ago, which made his current situation particularly problematic. The Garmin eTrex in his palm displayed coordinates that shouldn't exist, 5,147 feet on a trail section mapped at 5,400, and Lauren Hartwick's last radio transmission kept looping in his skull with the clarity of fresh trauma. There's someone watching from the tree line, but Daniel, he's not moving like he should. The October afternoon pressed against the North Cascades with the weight of accumulated snow that hadn't yet fallen. Daniel's breath formed small negotiations with the air, visible and temporary, while his boots ground volcanic soil against granite as he climbed past the maintained section of Cascade Pass Trail. 38 years old, 17 of them spent with the National Park Service, and he still couldn't silence the voice that whispered, "Maybe you're just broken. Maybe this is another one of your episodes." But Lauren's tent stood exactly where she'd pitched it 4 days ago, 1,800 feet below his current position. The nylon rippled in wind patterns that suggested something recently passed. The sleeping bag remained neatly rolled. The camp stove held a pot with 3-day-old oatmeal forming a surface like gray concrete. And her journal, the spiral-bound field notebook she'd filled with observations about gray wolf reintroduction patterns, sat open to October 17th, the last entry written in handwriting that deteriorated from her usual precise print into something resembling the EKG of a failing heart. Base, this is Reeves. Confirming no contact with Hartwick. Campsite appears abandoned mid-activity. Requesting additional SAR personnel for expanded search. Daniel's Motorola radio crackled with the specific static that mountains generated. Something about the granite's mineral content interfering with VHF frequencies. Copy that, Daniel. We've got Jenkins and Morales heading up from the ranger station. ETA 3 hours. Weather service shows front moving in tonight. You've got maybe 4 hours of workable light. Sarah Chen's voice carried the careful neutrality of someone who'd read his file, who knew about the incident in Olympic National Park, who understood that Daniel Reeves came with asterisks and qualifications. He didn't mention the tracks. They emerged from the forest approximately 60 yards northeast of Lauren's camp, following a trajectory that made no sense for wildlife or human traffic. The print suggested bare feet, the arch clearly defined, toes spread for purchase, but the depth indicated weight far exceeding what bare feet should risk on this terrain. More troubling was their pattern. They approached the campsite in a standard walking gait, then departed in bounds of 7 to 8 feet as if whatever made them had decided gravity was optional. Daniel photographed them with the digital camera NPS required for evidence documentation, then measured them with the small tape measure he carried. 11 inches, heel to toe. Width of 4 inches, 5 distinct toes, but the proportions were wrong. The big toe too long, the others curling inward in a way that suggested adaptation to gripping rather than walking. He'd seen similar prints before, though he'd never filed that report. 3 years ago, in the Hoh rainforest, when everything fell apart. The journal entry he'd been avoiding read, Day 12. Something's been paralleling my survey route for 3 days now. Stays about 100 yards out. Never visible, but I can feel the attention. It's not curious like the wolves. It's not cautious like the cougars. It feels old and patient. And I think it knows my name because last night I heard it spoken from somewhere in the dark, and it wasn't my voice on the recording device. Daniel's hands developed the tremor that arrived whenever his certainty began eroding. He pressed them against his thighs until the muscle tension overrode the shaking, a trick his therapist had taught him. The psychiatrist, the one the NPS mandated after Olympic, had used different words: dissociative episodes, trauma response, hypervigilance. Daniel preferred the simpler diagnosis. He saw things that weren't there, or failed to see things that were, and the gap between those possibilities was where he'd learned to exist. The temperature dropped 8 degrees in the span of 15 seconds. Daniel registered it not through feeling but through observation. His breath suddenly opaque, the moisture on the tent fly crystallizing into frost patterns. His Suunto barometric watch showed atmospheric pressure holding steady, no weather system explaining the localized change. "Lauren!" His voice struck the tree line and died. No echo. The sound simply stopped, as if the forest had swallowed it deliberately. He found her first cairn marker 200 yards upslope, following the disturbed ground where something had moved through the undergrowth with purposeful haste. Lauren had stacked 5 stones in the specific pattern NPS trained volunteers to use for trail marking. She was communicating, leaving signs she'd gone this direction voluntarily or been forced this way. The top stone was red jasper, speckled with what looked like rust but which Daniel's sinking recognition identified as blood. The second cairn stood another 300 yards higher, at the elevation where the forest transitioned from Douglas fir to mountain hemlock. This marker included 6 stones, and wedged between the third and fourth was a strip of fabric torn from Lauren's green field vest. The blood here was more pronounced, and fresh enough that it hadn't fully oxidized. Daniel's radio chirped. "Reeves, Chen, Jenkins, and Morales are asking about the search parameters. Do we have a direction of travel?" He stared at the cairn, at the blood, at the tree line above that seemed to writhe with shadows that moved against the wind's direction. "Northeast ascending. She's marking her route. Sarah, I need you to pull any incident reports from this area. Last 5 years. Disappearances, unusual animal behavior, anything that..." "Daniel." Sarah's voice carried the edge of professional concern. "We've already reviewed the area history. There haven't been any disappearances here. Check again. Expand to 10 years. Include unreported incidents, missing persons who were never officially connected to the park." Silence then. "What are you seeing up there?" What was he seeing? The cairns, the blood, the tracks that shouldn't exist, the temperature drops, the way sound behaved wrong. Or was he seeing the thing he always saw, when stress and isolation compressed his reality into something approximating his worst memories? The conviction that something predatory wore the world's appearance, hiding behind normalcy's mask? "Just check it, Sarah." The third cairn waited at 5,900 feet beyond the maintained trail, where the mountain skeleton emerged through thin soil. 7 stones, more blood, and carved into the largest rock with something sharp, a key or knife or fingernail, were 3 words in Lauren's handwriting. "Not what he." The message ended there, the incomplete thought more disturbing than any finished warning. Daniel's GPS showed he was now in the terrain locals called the Doubtful Country, a sprawl of subalpine forest and exposed ridge where fog generated spontaneously from the collision of Pacific moisture and mountain elevation. Maps became approximate here. Trails disappeared into game paths that dead-ended at cliff faces. The Forest Service had lost 2 surveyors in this section in the 1960s. Their remains were discovered 14 years later, 3 miles from their last known position, arranged in a pattern the official report described as inconsistent with natural dispersal or predation. He'd read that report during his rookie year, before he'd learned that some documents existed precisely to obscure rather than illuminate. The fog arrived as predicted, but from the wrong direction, rolling upslope rather than descending as if the mountain was exhaling. Visibility collapsed to 30 feet. Daniel activated his headlamp despite the afternoon hour, the LED beam creating a tunnel of clarity through the moisture. That's when he heard the breathing, not his own. He'd learned to distinguish his respiratory patterns from ambient sound, a necessary skill when paranoia had teeth. This breathing came from approximately 40 feet ahead, rhythmic and wet, like someone drowning in slow motion. It would inhale for 5 seconds, hold for 3, exhale for 7, the timing too precise to be unconscious. "Lauren?" The sound of his voice made something in the fog adjust its position. Not moving toward or away, just shifting laterally, maintaining distance. The breathing stopped. Daniel's hand found the canister of bear spray on his belt. 12 ounces of capsaicin concentrate effective to 30 feet. Useless against some things, essential against others. The ambiguity was the point. This is Ranger Daniel Reeves, North Cascades National Park Service. Identify yourself. Official protocol, ridiculous in context, but the familiar words created structure in spaces where structure was dissolving. The response came in Lauren's voice. He's not moving like he should. Exact intonation, precise replication of her radio transmission from 4 days ago. Except Lauren was 23, and the voice carried harmonics that suggested centuries, as if something ancient had learned to shape sounds into human language, but couldn't quite master the temporal resonance. Daniel's training said, auditory hallucination, stress-induced psychosis, your mind creating threats from memory. Daniel's instinct, the part of him that survived Olympic, said, run. He chose a third option, documentation. The camera came up, flash disabled, rapid sequence mode activated. 7 photographs of the fog, capturing nothing visible but creating time-stamped evidence that something happened here, that his perception of this moment existed in recordable reality. The fog contracted around him with pressure he could feel against his skin. Temperature dropped another 15 degrees. His exhalations froze instantly, ice crystals forming in the air before his face. Through the vapor he saw it, a figure standing at the exact edge of visibility, shaped like a man but proportioned wrong. Too tall, 7 feet minimum. Torso elongated, arms reaching past where knees should be, and the head canted at an angle that suggested the neck had been broken and improperly reset. It wore clothes, or something that resembled clothes, a Park Service uniform from decades past, the green and gray scheme used before the service updated its branding in the 1990s. The patches were correct, NPS arrowhead on the left shoulder, North Cascades designation on the right. The name tag read Howell in embroidered letters that hadn't faded despite apparent decades of exposure. Daniel's mind supplied the connection instantly. Marcus Howell, Ranger who disappeared in 1987 during a solo patrol. Never found. File closed after 7 years, presumed dead by misadventure. The thing wearing Howell's face smiled with too many teeth. The girl asked questions, it said, and the voice was chorus of voices. Howell's original baritone underneath, Lauren's soprano threaded through it, and beneath both of them something that sounded like wind through empty skulls. Questions about why the wolves avoid the high country, why the deer won't graze above 5,500 feet, why the trees grow wrong here, bent away from something they sense but cannot flee. Daniel's camera was still raised. His finger found the shutter. The flash fired automatically in the low light. He'd forgotten to disable it, and for the half-second of illumination he saw the thing clearly. Skin like parchment stretched too tight, stained with patterns that might have been veins, or might have been script in a language he didn't recognize. Eyes that reflected the flash with the specific tapetum lucidum gleam of nocturnal predators. And where the uniform's collar opened, he glimpsed the wound, the throat torn out, edges ragged, never healed. Strigoi. The word arrived from the research he'd done after Olympic, after he'd started trying to understand what categories of impossible might actually exist. Romanian folklore, the unclean dead, vampiric revenants who returned to drain life from the living. Not the romantic Dracula of fiction, but something older, something from when death was permeable and the dead's return was expected. The flash faded. The figure remained, unmoved by the light that should have revealed it as hallucination. You know what I am. Not a question. A statement of recognition that bound them both to the reality unfolding. You encountered one before. In the rainforest. You watched it feed on your partner and you ran. You survived because it had already eaten. You've spent 3 years wondering if you imagined the whole thing. Daniel's throat had become desert landscape. He managed, "Where's Lauren? Where all my food goes? Down into the mountain, to the places where Stone remembers being alive." She lasted longer than most. The girl had will. But will is seasoning, not sustenance. The thing that had been Marcus Howell took a step forward, joints bending in directions, Human anatomy prohibited. You're different, though. You're already half dead, already haunted. Killing you would be redundant. The Motorola on Daniel's belt erupted with static. Then Sarah's voice distorted. Daniel, pull out. Weathers. The transmission dissolved into white noise that resolved into breathing, into whispers in Romanian that Daniel's linguistics minor could partially translate. Mort viu, Strigoiul nu moare, sângele nu uită. The living dead, the Strigoi does not die, the blood does not forget. He ran. Training and rational thought evaporated. Daniel's body made decisions his consciousness couldn't process, feet finding purchase on loose scree, hands catching saplings for balance, breath coming in ragged tears as his cardiovascular system rediscovered what terror actually meant. Behind him, or beside him, or ahead of him, directionality became meaningless in the fog. He heard the thing's laughter, a sound like wind through a chest cavity that no longer required lungs. The cairn appeared suddenly, almost tripping him. The fourth marker, 8 stones stacked at the base of a massive Douglas fir, and clutched against the trunk, barely visible, was Lauren. She was alive. Technically. Her eyes tracked his approach with recognition, but her skin had acquired the translucent quality of advanced exsanguination. Her throat showed 2 wounds, not the theatrical punctures of fiction, but ragged tears where teeth had worried at the carotid until the artery gave way. The ground beneath her was dark with blood loss that should have been fatal hours ago. Daniel, she whispered, and her voice was her own, uncontaminated. He told me you'd come. He's been waiting for you. This is about Olympic, about the one you let feed while you ran. They talked to each other across distances, the dead ones, they remember debts. We're leaving. Daniel's hands found the compression bandages in his first aid kit, but even as he pressed them against her wounds, he knew the gesture was symbolic. She'd lost too much. The blood wasn't clotting. Her eyes had started showing the specific glaze that preceded systemic shutdown. He said I was the lure, that you wouldn't come for evidence or duty, but you'd come for a person, that your guilt makes you predictable. Lauren's hand found his, her fingers ice cold. He's made me like him. In between. I can feel it, the hunger, the way the world looks different now. Everything alive glows, Daniel. You're so bright it hurts to look at you. The fog parted. Howell, the thing that wore Howell's death, stood 15 feet away, patient as geology. The transformation takes 3 days to complete, it said. She'll die at dawn tomorrow, then wake at sunset as Strigoi. She'll remember being human, but she'll crave what humans carry in their veins. She'll hunt these mountains for decades, for centuries, adding to our numbers. You can't stop it, the infection is absolute. Daniel's bear spray cleared the holster. His thumb found the safety. 30 feet of effective range, and the thing stood at 15. The mathematics of desperation. Capsaicin? Howell's laughter. I don't have eyes that work anymore, Ranger. I see through other senses. The heat of your blood, the electricity of your nervous system. You could burn what's left of this face and I'd simply stop pretending to have one. Lauren's grip tightened on Daniel's hand with surprising strength. Kill me, she said, before it completes. There's a reason in the park regulations against open flames above 5,000 feet. Fire burns different up here. The air's thin enough that flames run cold, but they burn forever. The old growth is full of pitch. And Strigoi, she smiled, and her teeth had begun the slow transformation toward something designed for tearing. We're surprisingly flammable. Daniel's other hand found his lighter, the backup fire starter required in his emergency kit. Silver Zippo, butane reservoir 3/4 full. He'd never smoked, carried it purely for regulation compliance. The book, Lauren continued, her voice fading. The small black one in my tent, inside the sleeping bag where he wouldn't look. It's from my grandmother from the old country, Romania. She knew things, rituals. There's one for stopping the transformation, but you need... She coughed, and blood sprayed from her lips. You need the one who made you. You need to destroy them while you're still in between. Fire and prayer and witnesses, all three. The thing that had been Howell moved with speed that Daniel's perception couldn't track. There, then here, then behind him, covering 30 feet in a span of time too brief for physics. Its hand closed around Daniel's throat with pressure that collapsed his windpipe's cartilage. "You can't pray," it whispered against his ear. "You stopped believing in anything except your own brokenness. And there are no witnesses here except the girl, who's already mine." Daniel's vision sparkled with oxygen deprivation. His hand scrabbled against the thing's grip. Flesh like frozen leather, immovable. He was dying in the exact place where Lauren would die at dawn, where he'd become another statistic in a park known for swallowing people without explanation. Then Lauren's voice, stronger than it should be. "Îngerul morții, eliberează-l. Eu sunt martorul. Eu sunt sacrificiul." Daniel didn't speak Romanian beyond his miner's basic vocabulary, but the words carried power that transcended language. "The angel of death, release him. I am the witness. I am the sacrifice." The grip on his throat loosened. Howell turned toward Lauren with expression that might have been surprise, if its face still registered recognizable emotions. Lauren had dragged herself upright against the tree. In her right hand, Daniel didn't know when she'd acquired it, was his dropped lighter, flint wheel already rotating, flame jumping to life. In her left hand was a branch thick with pitch, the resin weeping from bark and amber tears. She touched the flame to the pitch and had caught with the specific hunger of old-growth sap. The flame blue-white, burning cold as promised, spreading across the branch's surface like liquid. "Grandfather," she said, speaking to Howell in a voice layered with generations. "My Bunica told me about you. Marcus Howell, who came from Bucharest in 1952, who changed his name and ran from what he'd become, who thought distance would break the curse. She said you'd been Strigoi for 200 years, that you'd fed on our family for centuries, that someone needed to end it." She thrust the burning branch into her own chest. The pitch ignited her clothes instantly. The synthetic fabrics of modern outdoor wear never designed for this, burning cold and complete. But the flame didn't stop at fabric. It spread across her skin like recognition, following the pathways of her circulatory system, burning from inside as the Strigoi's infection tried to complete itself and met something older. Fire as purification, as sacrifice, as the specific ritual her grandmother's book had prescribed. Howell screamed. The sound wasn't human, wasn't animal, was something that occurred when death realized it could still experience pain. The thing's body began to smoke, to smolder, flesh desiccating as whatever force animated it found the connection to Lauren severed in flames. "Run," Lauren said, and she was smiling despite burning. "Document this. Tell the story. Be the witness I can't be." Daniel ran. Behind him, the mountain hemlock forest ignited in a column of cold fire that shouldn't exist, that burned without heat, that consumed everything the Strigoi had touched or claimed over centuries. He heard Howell's death. Not the first death in 1987, but the final death. The one that occurred when fire found the core of what kept it animated and reduced it to ash that blew away in wind that came from nowhere. He ran until his lungs threatened rupture, until the elevation and terror combined into a state beyond panic. He ran until the Motorola's static resolved into Sarah's voice. "Daniel? Daniel, respond." "Hartwick is dead," he said into the radio, and his voice was automated, emotionless. "Fire on the mountain northeast of Cascade Pass. It's contained, specific to old growth section. Notify fire crews, but tell them it'll burn itself out by dawn. The dead ranger too. Howell. He was never missing, he was..." What could he say? What would the report read? "Get down here," Sarah said. "Now!" Daniel descended through darkness, his headlamp creating a tunnel of normalcy through nightmare. He reached Lauren's camp at midnight, found the journal wedged deep in her sleeping bag as promised. The black book was old, leather-bound, pages yellow with age. The text was Romanian, written in a careful hand, and the first entry was dated 1823. He read it by flashlight, his translator app struggling with the archaic dialect. It was a grimoire of sorts, a catalog of Strigoi behaviors, weaknesses, rituals for protection and destruction. Lauren's grandmother had compiled it over her lifetime, adding to knowledge passed through generations, and at the end Lauren herself had added entries in English, descriptions of Howell, observations of his hunting patterns, preparation for the confrontation she'd known was coming. She'd used herself as bait. Not for Howell. She'd known how to destroy him, knew the ritual required voluntary sacrifice. She'd been bait for Daniel, the witness required by the ritual's structure. Someone needed to survive to break the chain, to ensure Howell's destruction was witnessed and recorded, and could not be undone by folklore's tendency toward resurrection. Daniel photographed every page of the book. Then he burned it, as the final entry instructed. The ash he scattered across Lauren's camp, the last component of a ritual designed by people who understood that some knowledge was too dangerous to preserve. Jenkins and Morales found him at dawn, sitting outside the tent, his GPS showing tracks that, according to topographic maps, shouldn't exist. The fire crews reported a burned section of forest roughly 1 acre in size. The trees consumed completely, but the burn area's perimeter unnaturally distinct, as if the fire had understood borders. They found Lauren's remains in the center of the burn. The ME would determine cause of death as exposure and animal predation, with the fire occurring post-mortem. Convenient lies that fit paperwork requirements. They found Howell's remains too, though the official report would describe them as unidentified historical remains, likely from early park history. The bones showed evidence of extreme age. Carbon dating would suggest early 19th century, and trauma consistent with violent death. His Park Service uniform had survived the fire in fragments, enough for identification. The mystery of his 1987 disappearance would be closed with quiet efficiency. Daniel's statement was simple. He'd followed Hartwick's trail markers, found her deceased from exposure, discovered the historical remains nearby, and a lightning strike had ignited the localized fire. Plausible. Documented. Requiring no explanation that ventured into territories where his credibility was already compromised. Sarah Chen read his report in silence then. The photographs from your camera show something else. Fog, Daniel said. Low visibility conditions. Some of the images show a figure. Enhanced analysis suggests... Pareidolia, Daniel interrupted. The human tendency to see faces in random patterns. I was experiencing significant stress, high elevation, environmental extremes. My perception was compromised. Sarah looked at him for a long moment. Then she closed the file. Get some rest, Daniel. Take a month. We'll have the counselor do the standard evaluation before you return to duty. He took 3 months, spent them researching, compiling his own version of Lauren's grandmother's grimoire. The internet was full of folklore, of scattered reports that aligned with Strigoi behavior. Disappearances in remote areas where bodies were never found or found with specific trauma patterns. He cross-referenced incident reports from national parks across the country, looking for signatures. Missing persons, unusual animal behavior, localized temperature anomalies. He found 12 possible locations where Strigoi might be active. In his mandated therapy sessions, he discussed his Olympic experience, the thing he'd seen feeding on his partner, the guilt of survival, the 3 years of uncertainty about what was real. His therapist nodded, made notes, prescribed medications that Daniel didn't take. The official diagnosis remained PTSD with dissociative features, improving with treatment. What Daniel knew, he'd witnessed something impossible. He'd documented it. He'd survived it. And the survival came with obligation. When he returned to duty, he requested transfer to the parks on his list. Sarah Chen denied the requests. His psychological profile suggested stability in familiar environments, avoiding triggers. So Daniel stayed in the North Cascades, working the trails where Lauren died, where Howell died the second time, where the forest grew back around the burn scar with specific avoidance patterns that suggested the trees remembered. Some nights when the wind came from the northeast, Daniel heard voices in languages he didn't speak, warnings or invitations he couldn't determine. He'd stopped trusting his perceptions, but he'd also stopped dismissing them. The gap between those positions was where truth lived, ambiguous, dangerous, requiring constant navigation. He kept Lauren's field notes, the copies he'd made before destroying the original. He added his own observations, The document grew into something between journal and testimony, evidence compiled for a trial that would never occur in any court that acknowledged reality's conventional boundaries. On the anniversary of Lauren's death, Daniel hiked to the burn scar. The trees had regrown, alder and hemlock young and flexible, but nothing grew at the exact center, where she'd burned and Howell had finally died. The soil there was dark, rich, but sterile. No seeds took root. No mushrooms decomposed the ash. The earth itself remembered, refusing to forget. Daniel placed a small cairn there, 7 stones for the 7 decades Howell had hunted in these mountains after fleeing whatever life he'd destroyed in Romania. Not a memorial, a marker, a warning to whatever else might be watching from the spaces between trees, from the elevations where maps became approximate and reality became negotiable. He spoke the words Lauren had taught him, the Romanian phrases her grandmother had compiled. Îngerul morții recunoaște sacrificiul, pământul își amintește, sângele a fost plătit. The angel of death recognized the sacrifice. The earth remembers. The blood has been paid. The wind shifted. The temperature dropped. And for just a moment, brief enough to dismiss as imagination, persistent enough to catalog as evidence, Daniel felt something watching him. Not hostile, not grateful, simply aware, acknowledging the testimony he offered, the witness he'd become. He descended before dark, his GPS tracking a route that matched the topographic maps exactly. Behind him, the cairn stood against the mountain's geometry, marking the place where folklore became fact, where the dead refused to stay buried, where a young woman had burned herself to ash to break a cycle that had persisted for centuries. Daniel's radio remained silent. His descent was uneventful. The trailhead appeared exactly where it should, and his truck started on the first turn of the key. The world behaved as if nothing impossible had occurred, as if the supernatural was still safely categorized as superstition. But Daniel Reeves had stopped trusting the world's performance of normalcy. He'd learned that horror wore reality's mask, that the dead walked mountains in stolen flesh, that some debts transcended death and demanded payment in fire and sacrifice in witness. He drove home through darkness that felt populated, aware, patient. Somewhere in the North Cascades, in the doubtful country where maps were suggestions and elevation was negotiable, the forest grew around spaces it would not reclaim, and Daniel carried in his mind the knowledge that would never fit in any official report, the testimony that would never be believed, the evidence that existed in the gap between what he'd seen and what he could prove. The gap where truth lived, where horror waited, where the Strigoi might still be watching, wondering if the debt was truly paid or if some balance remained unsettled. Daniel had stopped trusting his perceptions, but he'd also stopped dismissing them. And in that ambiguity, in that space between certainty and doubt, he'd found something resembling purpose. He was the witness, the document, the warning, and the dead, as always, were patient. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened. Christopher Milliken kept his reports clinical because emotion clouded data. At 34, he'd spent 8 seasons with the National Park Service, the last 3 at Glacier, and he'd learned that the wilderness killed through statistics, not malice. Hypothermia occurred at predictable temperatures. Falls happened on specific trail sections with quantifiable frequency. Even animal attacks followed behavioral patterns you could chart. Missing persons cases resolved through systematic grid searches, probability calculations, and the unfortunate mathematics of human error. So when the call came through his Motorola radio at 0647 on October 14, 2009, about Rachel Hendricks, 72 hours overdue from a solo hike on the Avalanche Creek Trail, Chris approached it the way he approached everything, as a problem with variables to isolate and solve. Copy that, dispatch. I'll head up from Lake McDonald. Solo hiker, female 27, last known position was the Avalanche Lake campsite. He was already calculating. October in Glacier meant temperatures dropping to the low 30s at night at the higher elevations. Rachel was experienced. He'd checked her permit history while dispatch was still talking. 3 previous backpacking trips in the park, all completed without incident. Her gear list was thorough, not the profile of someone who made fatal mistakes. Chris loaded his pack with the efficiency of routine: first aid kit, emergency bivvy, extra water purification tablets, his Garmin eTrex GPS unit, the one he'd upgraded to earlier that year, though the satellite coverage still turned unreliable in the deep valleys, flares, space blanket, rope. His service-issue Remington 870 shotgun went in last, for bears, ostensibly. In 8 years, he'd never fired it outside the range. The trail up Avalanche Creek cut through old-growth cedar and hemlock, the forest floor soft with decades of needles and moss. Chris made good time to the lake, 4.3 miles, elevation gain of 500 feet, completed in 90 minutes. His boots knew this path. He'd hiked it 40, maybe 50 times. The lake sat calm under an overcast sky, the surrounding peaks, Bear Hat Mountain to the north, Mount Cannon to the south, their usual pre-winter gray. Rachel's campsite was immediately wrong. Not wrong in the way a civilian would notice. No obvious signs of struggle, no scattered gear, but wrong in the way that made Chris's analytical mind snag on details that didn't align. Her tent stood properly staked, fly-taut, doors zipped shut. Her food bag hung correctly from the bear cable 30 feet away. But her boots sat outside the tent entrance, laces still tied. The camp stove remained assembled on a flat rock, a pot beside it with perhaps an inch of water in the bottom, the water filmed with a thin skin of ice. Chris photographed everything with his digital camera, documenting positions and distances. Then he called out, "Rachel Hendricks, National Park Service." His voice carried across the still water and returned to him unchanged. He tried twice more, listening to the silence between his calls. Nothing moved in the forest except some small birds in the higher branches. He approached the tent, noting that the ground around it showed no disturbance beyond what Rachel would have created setting up camp. No animal tracks, no drag marks. The tent's zipper pull hung on the outside, which meant someone, presumably Rachel, had exited and closed it behind her. Chris pulled it down. Her sleeping bag lay bunched at the foot of the tent, the kind of disorder consistent with someone climbing out in the morning. Her backpack leaned against the far wall, contents apparently intact. He inventoried methodically. Spare clothes, water bottles, both full, toiletries, first aid kit, map, bear spray, unused, headlamp, and, this made him pause, her cell phone, powered off. Chris checked his own phone. No signal, which was expected this far in. But Rachel, who carried a phone, had left it in her pack. He turned it on, waiting through the startup sequence. Battery at 43%. When it finished booting, the lock screen showed the time she'd last used it. 6:47 p.m., October 11th, 3 days ago. No desperate attempts to call for help. No final messages. She'd simply stopped using it. He backed out of the tent and stood, looking at the campsite with fresh calculation. A woman prepares dinner or starts to. The stove was out but assembled. She goes to sleep. In the morning, she emerges from her tent, removes her boots but doesn't put on other shoes, and then... what? Walks into the forest in her socks? The ground was too soft for tracks, the carpet of needles revealing nothing. Chris spent the next hour executing a standard search pattern, spiraling outward from the camp in expanding circles, marking each pass with the GPS unit. He found nothing. No torn fabric, no blood, no signs of Rachel. The forest seemed to have simply absorbed her. At 13:20 hours, he radioed dispatch with his findings. Camp is intact, no signs of struggle or animal activity. Subject's personal effects, including phone, are present, requesting additional SAR personnel. Dispatch confirmed they'd send a team up the following morning. Weather was deteriorating, and they wouldn't risk personnel on the trail in darkness. Chris would spend the night at the campsite. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, he established his own camp 20 yards from Rachel's, maintaining the scene's integrity. The temperature had already dropped noticeably. Chris estimated it would hit 28 degrees by dawn. He ate an MRE without tasting it, documenting his observations in a weatherproof notebook. Everything remained explicable. Disorientation, perhaps. A head injury causing erratic behavior. She could be hypothermic, wandering. He'd seen it before. People found miles from where they should have been, their decision-making compromised by cold or panic. Except Rachel's gear showed no signs of panic. Everything was too orderly. The sun set early behind the peaks, and the forest transitioned from gray to black with unsettling speed. Chris hung his food bag, checked his radio battery, and settled into his tent with his headlamp. He intended to review Rachel's phone more thoroughly, look for any context in her messages or photos. But when he powered it on again, something had changed. The lock screen now showed a different time. 11:34 p.m., October 14th. Tonight, just 20 minutes ago. Chris felt the first prickle of genuine unease travel through his chest. He hadn't touched the phone since earlier. It had been in his pack, powered off. There was no way for it to have been used. He checked the recent activity. The phone log showed an outgoing call attempt at 11:34 p.m. to a number with a 406 area code, local Montana. The call had lasted 0 seconds. No connection. Chris forced himself to think systematically. A glitch. Phone clocks did strange things sometimes, especially when they'd been powered off. The call could have been a preset alarm or reminder that triggered during boot up. But even as he constructed these explanations, they felt thin. He was still holding the phone when it rang. The sound shattered the silence of the tent. Chris actually jerked, the phone nearly slipping from his hand. The screen showed the same 406 number, the one the phone had tried to call 20 minutes ago, now calling back. Without thinking, he answered. Hello? The audio quality was terrible, a wash of static and distortion that made his ear hurt. But underneath the noise, he could hear breathing. Wet, labored breathing. And then, very faint, a voice. Female. Chris. His throat tightened. Rachel? Rachel Hendricks, is that you? More static rising and falling in waves. The breathing continued, ragged. Then the voice again, slightly clearer. Don't. Stay, don't. Rachel, what's your location? I'm at your campsite, The breathing changed. Became something else. Something that didn't sound like breathing anymore, but like a different kind of inhalation. Deeper, slower, with a quality that made Chris think of hunger, and underneath it, very faint. Something that might have been words in a language he didn't recognize. Syllables that sounded harsh, Eastern European perhaps, with too many consonants. Then the connection died. Chris sat in his tent, staring at the phone. The call had lasted 41 seconds. He could still hear that final sound in his mind. That breathing that wasn't quite breathing. He told himself it was audio distortion, poor connection, the phone's speaker damaged, but his hands trembled slightly as he set the device down. The night pressed against his tent with a weight that felt almost physical. Chris turned off his headlamp to save battery and lay in his sleeping bag, listening. The forest offered no sound. No wind, no animals, nothing. Just a silence so complete it became its own presence. He didn't sleep well. When he did drift off, his dreams were full of the wet breathing sound, and twice he woke convinced someone was outside his tent, standing just beyond the fabric. But when he checked, unzipping the entrance, shining his flashlight into the darkness, nothing was there. At 06:30, Chris emerged from his tent into a dawn that felt wrong in ways he couldn't immediately articulate. The temperature had dropped further than he'd predicted. His breath hung white and heavy in the air. But that wasn't it. The light itself seemed different, thinner somehow, less substantial, and the silence persisted. No birds, no wind, nothing. Rachel's tent looked the same. He photographed it again, documenting that nothing had changed overnight, then began a wider search pattern while waiting for the SAR team. The GPS unit functioned erratically, the elevation readings fluctuating by hundreds of feet even when he stood still. He marked the discrepancies in his notebook, adding them to a growing list of small inconsistencies that his mind kept trying to explain away. At 8:47, he found the first track. It wasn't much, just a partial impression in a patch of mud near the lake's eastern shore. But it was clearly a footprint and clearly wrong. Too long, the toes too pronounced. The depth suggested significant weight, more than 180 pounds. But the stride, he found a second print 12 feet away, exceeded any human gait Chris had ever seen. He photographed the prints from multiple angles, including a shot with his Park Service ID card for scale. Then he tried the radio. Static. He adjusted the frequency, tried again. More static, with occasional breaks that might have been voices or might have been audio pareidolia. The radio had worked fine yesterday. He checked the battery, full charge. He cycled through emergency channels, nothing but that wash of white noise. The isolation settled on him like a physical thing. No radio contact, GPS unreliable, and now tracks that made no sense. Chris stood at the lake's edge and forced himself to apply logic. The prints could be Rachel's. Boots distorting in mud looked strange sometimes. The stride could be explained by running, leaping between stones. The radio issues were terrain-related, the satellites not aligned properly. Everything had an explanation, but he didn't believe any of them. He was still standing there when he heard the sound from the forest behind him. A crack of branches, sharp and close. Chris spun, hand automatically moving to the shotgun slung across his back. Something large moved through the trees, perhaps 30 yards upslope. He caught a glimpse of dark fabric, a jacket maybe, and called out, "Rachel!" The movement stopped. Chris waited, his pulse suddenly loud in his ears. Then, very deliberately, whatever was up there began moving again. Not toward him, parallel to his position, walking along the slope at a steady pace. He could hear each footfall distinctly in the silent forest. Chris made a decision and pursued. He climbed quickly, breathing hard, trying to close the distance. The thing ahead of him maintained its pace, neither speeding up nor slowing down. He couldn't see it clearly through the trees, just occasional flashes of dark color and movement. After 5 minutes he stopped, lungs burning, and called out again. "Rachel, it's Chris Milliken, National Park Service. I'm here to help you." The movement stopped. Silence stretched out. Then from the trees ahead, a voice replied. Female, recognizably Rachel's voice from the photo on her permit, but with something off about the tone, something that made the hair on Chris's forearms stand up despite the layers of clothing. Chris. Just his name, flat and effectless. "Rachel, stay where you are, I'm coming to you." No. The voice was clearer now, and Chris realized what was wrong with it. No breath sounds, no aspiration. Each word emerged with mechanical precision. "You need to leave." "I can't do that." "Are you hurt? What happened?" A pause. Then, "I died, Chris." The words hung in the air between them. Chris felt something cold and liquid move through his stomach. "Rachel, you're in shock. Let me help you." "I died 3 nights ago. I shouldn't have come here. There are old things in these mountains. Things your reports don't account for." A bitter sound that might have been laughter. No statistical models for this. Chris pushed forward, closing the distance. He could see her now, or at least a figure in dark clothing standing in a grove of aspens. Female, the right height and build. But something about the posture wasn't right. Too still. No small movements. No weight shifts. No signs of breathing. "Rachel, I need you to..." She turned to face him, and Chris's words died in his throat. Her face was Rachel's. He recognized her from the permit photo. Oval face, dark hair pulled back, strong jawline. But the skin held a waxy quality, gray-white like old meat. Her eyes, when they met his, reflected the dim morning light with a reddish sheen that shouldn't have been possible. And her mouth, opened slightly, revealed teeth that looked too sharp, too long, stained dark at the gums. "I tried to warn you," she said in that breathless voice, "on the phone. But it's hard to maintain, hard to remember being human. It wants to feed." Chris's hand found the shotgun. He didn't draw it, but his fingers wrapped around the grip. Every rational part of his mind screamed that this was impossible. Hypothermia, head trauma, contaminated water, anything but what his eyes were showing him. But another part, older and more primal, recognized exactly what he was seeing. "What are you?" The question came out as barely a whisper. "Strigoi." The word was foreign, harsh. That's what the old woman called it before it made me do what I did to her. There was an old woman. In the cabin, half-mile north of the lake, she was alone. I came across it during my hike, thought maybe I could fill my water there. She spoke Romanian mostly. I didn't understand, but she understood what was happening to me. Rachel's head tilted at an angle that bent too far. She tried to help. There are rituals, you see. Orthodox prayers, silver, specific words. But I was already too far gone. And it was so hungry. Chris's mind raced, trying to process this, to file it into categories that made sense. He'd read about Strigoi, European folklore, vampiric revenants, part of Romanian mythology. But folklore wasn't supposed to manifest in Glacier National Park, wasn't supposed to manifest anywhere outside of books. "Why didn't you leave?" he asked. "Why stay at the campsite?" "I can't leave, not until—" She trailed off, then spoke again, and this time her voice held an edge of desperation. "Chris, it's getting harder to think. The hunger is everything. You need to go, now, before dusk. They're strongest after dark, and I don't know if I can—" She stopped mid-sentence, her whole body going rigid. The change was instantaneous. One moment she looked almost human, tragic, and the next something else looked out through her eyes. Something older and infinitely hungry. "Run," she whispered. Chris ran. He crashed back down the slope, all systematic grid patterns forgotten, moving purely on instinct. Behind him, he heard Rachel give chase, and the sound of her pursuit was all wrong. Too fast, not constrained by terrain or obstacles, more like water flowing downhill than a person running. Branches snapped. Something growled, low and eager. He made it to the campsite and didn't stop, just grabbed his pack and kept moving toward the trail down. The shotgun bounced against his back. He could load it, turn and fight, but fight what? Everything he'd been taught, everything he believed about the world, insisted this was impossible. Yet the sound of Rachel, the thing that had been Rachel, closing the distance behind him, was brutally, undeniably real. The trail blurred past. Chris's lungs burned, his legs screaming. But he didn't slow. Once, he risked a glance back and saw her, closer than should have been possible, her face twisted into something between rage and anguish. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, and he saw her mouth form words. "I'm sorry." Then she veered off the trail, vanishing into the trees as suddenly as she'd appeared. Chris didn't stop running until he reached the trailhead. His truck sat exactly where he'd left it, looking impossibly normal and mundane. He threw his pack in the bed, climbed in, locked the doors, as if locks would matter, and sat shaking behind the wheel. His training, his education, his entire worldview insisted he'd experienced some kind of break. Stress hallucination, carbon monoxide from a faulty camp stove, contaminated water causing fever dreams. But he couldn't make himself believe it. The fear felt too real. The memory of Rachel's face, her voice saying Strigoi, the wrongness of her movement, it all had the weight of lived experience. The truck started on the first try. Chris drove to the ranger station in West Glacier, rehearsing how he'd report this. "How did you tell your supervisor that the missing person was dead? Was something else? Was stalking the forest?" "You didn't. You couldn't. They'd pull you from duty, order psychological evaluation, put the incident down to exposure and stress." But he had evidence. The photos of the tracks. Rachel's phone with its impossible call log. His documentation of the campsite. At the station, his supervisor, Marcus Chen, 15 years with the service, unflappable, took one look at Chris's face and sat him down. "What happened up there?" Chris opened his mouth, then closed it. He pulled out his camera, brought up the photos of the tracks. Marcus leaned in, studying them. "Bear?" Marcus suggested. "No." Chris cycled through the images. "Look at the toe definition, the stride length." Marcus frowned. Could be distortion from the mud. We'll send a team up. Do a proper cast. Marcus, there's more. Chris described the campsite, the strange call on Rachel's phone, the malfunctioning equipment. He left out the encounter with Rachel herself. He couldn't bring himself to say those words, but Marcus must have seen something in his face. Chris, how much did you sleep last night? I'm not... Chris stopped himself. Something is wrong up there. Wrong in ways I can't explain. We need to pull everyone back, not send more people in. You're recommending we abandon a SAR operation? I'm recommending... What was he recommending? That they call in a priest? Bring silver bullets? The absurdity of it threatened to pull a hysterical laugh from his chest. I need to go back up there tonight, but I need specific equipment. Marcus studied him for a long moment. What kind of equipment? Chris thought about the old woman Rachel had mentioned, the cabin half a mile north of Avalanche Lake. If she'd known what Rachel was becoming, if she'd tried to help with rituals and prayers, then maybe, just maybe, she'd left something behind. Instructions, protection, something grounded in folklore older than rationality. I need to requisition some personal time, Chris said. 48 hours, and I need you to keep the trail closed. Chris, please, Marcus, I've never asked for anything. 8 years, I've followed every protocol. I'm asking now, 2 days. Keep the trail closed and let me handle this. Marcus's expression showed deep concern, but after a moment he nodded. 48 hours. But if you're not back, or if I don't hear from you, I'm sending in a full team. Chris left the station and drove into Kalispell. The public library had internet access and he had research to do. He'd spent his career dismissing folklore as superstition, but superstition lasted for centuries because it contained truth. Not scientific truth, but something older. Survival knowledge encoded in stories. He searched for everything he could find on Strigoi. The results painted a picture that matched too closely what he'd witnessed. Romanian folklore spoke of the undead who rose from improper burial or violent death, who maintained their intelligence but lost their humanity, driven by insatiable hunger. The sources agreed on certain details. Strigoi were strongest at night, could drain life force or blood, were difficult to kill permanently. But they also agreed on weaknesses. Orthodox Christian prayers and holy water could repel them. Silver caused them pain. A stake through the heart followed by decapitation would destroy them, but only if performed by someone with the authority and knowledge to bind the spirit. And there were words, specific incantations in Romanian or Church Slavonic, that could compel them to respond to questions or temporarily weaken their power. Chris printed everything he could find. Then he drove to a sporting goods store and bought a hunting knife with a solid silver inlay. Overpriced tourist piece, but it was the closest thing to a silver weapon he could find. At a Catholic supply store, he purchased a rosary and a vial of holy water, feeling ridiculous but determined. The teenager behind the counter didn't even blink at the unusual order. By the time he returned to the park, dusk was approaching. He had perhaps an hour of daylight left. Marcus had marked the Avalanche Creek Trail closed with official NPS barriers. Chris went around them. The hike up felt different in the fading light. Every shadow held potential threat. Chris kept the shotgun loaded now, buckshot in the chamber, the silver knife strapped to his belt. The holy water and rosary were in his chest pocket. He felt like a character in a bad horror movie, but the fear vibrating through his nervous system was entirely real. He reached the campsite as full darkness fell. Both tents stood unchanged, ghostly in the beam of his headlamp. Chris didn't set up camp this time. Instead, he moved north, searching for the cabin Rachel had mentioned. He found it 20 minutes later, nearly invisible in the trees. A small structure, barely more than a shed, with a corrugated metal roof and walls of weathered logs. No light showed through the single window. Chris approached cautiously, calling out a greeting in case anyone was inside. No response. The door hung open. Chris shined his light inside and immediately wished he hadn't. The interior was perhaps 10 feet square. A cot against one wall, a small table, an icon of the Virgin Mary above the door, rendered in the Byzantine style with gold leaf that caught his light. And on the floor, in the center of the room, a large dark stain that Chris's clinical mind recognized as blood. A lot of blood. Far too much for someone to lose and survive. But there was no body. Just the stain, and scattered around it, the remnants of what looked like a ritual. A circle drawn in white powder, salt, Chris guessed. Candles, melted to stubs. And books. Several books in what might have been Romanian, their pages marked with strips of cloth. Chris knelt, carefully avoiding the bloodstain, and examined the books. He couldn't read the text, but he could see drawings, diagrams of symbols, illustrations of figures that resembled Rachel's transformed state. Instructions, maybe, for dealing with Strigoi. One book lay open to a page showing a complex symbol drawn inside a circle, with what looked like prayers written around it in Cyrillic script. He photographed the page with his digital camera, then several others. Maybe he could find someone to translate. But even without translation, some elements were clear. The symbol required silver to draw. The circle needed salt or consecrated ash, and it had to be completed before the Strigoi entered. A sound outside the cabin made him freeze. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the structure. Chris gripped the shotgun, his heart hammering. The footsteps stopped at the doorway. "You found where she lived," Rachel's voice said from the darkness. "The woman who knew, who tried to save me." Chris stayed crouched, the shotgun aimed at the door. "Rachel, we can—" "There is no we, Chris. There's just you, alive, and me, no longer. The thing wearing my body doesn't care about data analysis or statistical models. It only wants to feed." A pause. "But there's still enough of me left to warn you, to give you a chance. The old woman's ritual, if you can complete it, if you can trap me inside the circle at dawn, you might be able to end this." "End it how?" "The books explain it. Find someone who reads Romanian. Follow the instructions exactly. It requires silver through the heart, then." She made a sound that might have been a sob. "Then you separate the head from the body. Burn both. Bury the ashes in unconsecrated ground." Chris's hand tightened on the shotgun. "I can't." "You have to. Because if you don't, I'll keep killing. The hunger doesn't stop, it's already starting to spread. I can feel it like a sickness. Everyone I feed on has the potential to become what I am. It's how they propagate." Her voice grew harder. "You have until dawn. After that, enough of me will be gone that I won't be able to help you anymore. I'll just hunt you like I've hunted everyone who comes into these mountains." "Everyone? You think I'm the first?" "The old woman? She wasn't here by accident. She was watching, waiting. She'd seen the signs before." "This place?" Rachel's voice dropped to a whisper. "Something about these mountains draws them, or maybe creates them. Old places, old things. Your scientific method can't explain everything, Chris." The footsteps resumed, moving away from the cabin. Chris forced himself to stand, to move to the doorway. He could see Rachel's silhouette perhaps 20 yards away, standing at the edge of his headlamp's reach. She didn't look human at all anymore. The proportions were wrong, the movements too fluid. "I'll be waiting," she said. "At the lake, at dawn. If you decide to try the ritual, that's where you'll find me. But Chris, I might not be alone. I can feel others in these woods, older ones. They're curious about you." Then she turned and walked into the darkness, her form dissolving into shadow. Chris stood in the cabin doorway, shaking. Everything in his training screamed that he should retreat, call for backup, approach this systematically. But backup meant more people exposed to this, and systematic approaches required time he didn't have. He gathered the books from the cabin, along with the unused candles and what remained of the salt. The old woman had prepared for this. She'd known. He tried not to think about her final moments, tried not to imagine Rachel, or the thing she'd become, attacking in this small space. The amount of blood suggested it had been fast, at least. Brutal, but fast. Chris returned to the campsite and did something he'd never done in his career. He prayed. Not to the God of his occasional church-attending childhood, but to whatever force might listen, might help. The night pressed around him, full of sounds that might have been wind or might have been movement. Twice, he saw figures at the edge of his light, standing still, watching. He didn't look directly at them, didn't acknowledge them, just kept working, laying out his supplies, reviewing the photographs of the book pages. He had no translator, no expert in Orthodox Christian ritual, no backup, just himself, his analytical mind, and folklore he'd dismissed his entire life. At some point during the night, he realized he was crying, silent tears running down his face as he worked. Not from fear exactly, though there was plenty of that, but from the sheer magnitude of what he'd discovered. The world was larger and stranger and more terrible than he'd ever imagined. Dawn approached with aching slowness. Chris worked until the first gray light touched the eastern peaks, then gathered his supplies and walked to the lakeshore. He found a flat area of bare earth and began drawing the circle, using the silver knife to score the pattern into the dirt. It had to be exact. The photograph showed specific angles, specific proportions. His hand trembled, but he forced it steady. This was just another kind of data collection, another set of variables to control. The salt went next, outlining the silver lines, the candles at cardinal points, and in the center, open to the page of prayers, one of the old woman's books. Chris stood back, reviewing his work. It matched the photograph as closely as he could manage. The sun broke over Mount Cannon, its light turning the lake's surface gold. And Rachel walked out of the forest. She looked worse in daylight, the waxy quality of her skin more pronounced, her movements mechanical and wrong. But she walked to the circle and stopped at its edge, staring down at the silver lines. "You did it correctly," she said, sounding almost proud. "The old woman taught you well, even in death." "Rachel, my name doesn't matter anymore. Names are for the living." She looked up at him, and for a moment, her eyes held something human. "Thank you, Chris, for not running, for trying to help even when help meant this." "I can't do this," Chris said. "I can't kill you. I'm already dead. You'd just be finishing it properly." She stepped into the circle, and as her foot crossed the silver line, she flinched, a grimace crossing her features. "The binding holds. I can't leave now until you release me or the sun sets, so you have all day to decide." Chris sank to the ground outside the circle, suddenly exhausted. "Tell me what happened. All of it." So she did. The story came out in fragments. How she'd felt wrong on her first night at the lake, feverish and strange. How she'd encountered the old woman the next morning and been invited inside for tea. The woman had known immediately what was happening, had tried to intervene with prayers and salt circles. But the transformation was already too advanced. "I killed her," Rachel said flatly. "The hunger was everything. I tore out her throat and drank until there was nothing left, and with each swallow I could feel myself changing, becoming less. The woman's spirit fought me, I could feel it, her Orthodox faith trying to hold me back. But I was stronger. The hunger made me stronger." "How did it start?" Chris asked. "What infected you?" "I don't know. Maybe something in the water. Maybe I disturbed an old grave while hiking. The woman said these mountains hold old things, buried things. European settlers brought their folklore with them, their beliefs and their curses. Maybe belief is enough. Maybe if you believe something hard enough, it becomes real." Chris thought about that, about the collective weight of centuries of human fear and story, condensing into something that could reach across an ocean and manifest in American wilderness. It violated everything he understood about causality and physical law. But then so did the thing sitting cross-legged in the circle, wearing Rachel's face. "There are others," Rachel continued. "I can sense them. Old Strigoi. Ones that have been here for decades, maybe longer. They feed carefully, take hikers who won't be missed immediately. The statistics you track, the missing persons who never turn up. Some of them are like me now." Chris felt cold despite the rising sun. "How many?" "I don't know. Enough that I could call them if I wanted. Enough that they'd come." She met his eyes. "I'm choosing not to. The woman's faith, it left something in me. Or maybe there's still enough of Rachel Hendricks left to make one good choice, but that won't last. By tonight, I'll just be hunger. So decide, Chris. Decide if you can do what needs doing. He sat there for hours, watching Rachel in the circle. She didn't move, barely seemed to breathe. Just sat with inhuman patience, waiting for his decision. The books lay beside him. He'd photographed every page, but he couldn't read them. Couldn't follow the ritual precisely. He'd be guessing, approximating. It might not work. Or it might work perfectly. And he'd have to drive a silver knife through Rachel's chest, then use his hunting knife to saw through her spine. The clinical part of his mind calculated the force required, the angle of blade, the number of strokes. The human part wanted to vomit. At 3 in the afternoon, Chris stood. He'd made his decision, or the decision had made itself. He couldn't allow Rachel to continue. Couldn't let the infection spread. It was statistical. 1 death versus how many potential victims? The math was clear, even if the execution was anything but. "Thank you," Rachel said when he approached the circle. "It takes courage to face the impossible." "I don't feel courageous. I feel like I'm going insane." "Maybe you are. Maybe we both are. Does it matter?" She looked up at the sky. "The sun is still high. Do it now, while there's light. While I can still help you." Chris drew the silver knife. His hand shook. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. You're giving me something I can't give myself. An ending." She smiled, and it was almost human. "Do it quickly. Aim for the heart, left of center, angled up between the 4th and 5th ribs. The anatomy's still the same." He stepped into the circle, felt the resistance of the binding, a pressure in the air, like static electricity. Rachel knelt, pulling aside her jacket to expose her sternum. Her skin had taken on an almost translucent quality in the afternoon sun. Chris raised the knife. Every instinct screamed at him to stop, that this was murder, that there had to be another way. But he thought about the old woman, alone in her cabin, trying to fight back against something impossible. Thought about all the hikers who might disappear if he walked away. Thought about Rachel, the real Rachel, who'd loved these mountains enough to hike them alone. He drove the knife down. Rachel gasped, a wet, terrible sound. Her eyes went wide, showing full whites. Chris felt the blade slide between ribs, felt it penetrate deeper than should have been possible, and then felt something else. A resistance, like piercing a membrane. And when that membrane broke, Rachel's body convulsed. Black smoke poured from her mouth, her nose, her eyes. It roiled in the air above her, coalescing into a shape that hurt to look at directly. Vaguely human, but wrong in fundamental ways. The shape screamed, a sound that made Chris's teeth ache and his vision blur. Then it dissipated, shredding apart in the afternoon breeze like fog. Rachel's body slumped forward, catching against the knife still embedded in her chest. Chris held her, lowering her carefully to the ground. Her eyes had cleared, the reddish sheen gone. She looked almost like her permit photo again. "Thank you." The words were barely audible. "Tell my sister, bear attack. Don't let her know." Then the light went out of her eyes, and Rachel Hendricks, the real Rachel, was finally, truly dead. Chris completed the ritual because he had to, because the books indicated it was necessary to prevent the spirit from returning. He used his hunting knife for the rest, working mechanically, trying not to think about what he was doing. The fire took hours to burn down. He stayed with it until nothing remained but ash and bone fragments. He buried these on the north side of the lake, beyond the old woman's cabin, in ground that had never seen blessing or consecration. Marked the spot with a cairn that looked natural, unremarkable, just stones. Then he walked back down the trail in darkness, not caring about the risk. He needed to be out of these mountains, needed distance, needed the illusion of normalcy, even if that illusion had been permanently shattered. Marcus was waiting at the ranger station. One look at Chris's face and he didn't ask questions. Just poured coffee, black and hot, and sat across from him. "I found Rachel," Chris said eventually. She's gone. Bear attack. Very little remains. I've documented the site. Marcus studied him. That's the official report? That's the report that makes sense. That fits the data. And unofficially? Chris looked at his supervisor, this man who'd trusted him for 3 years. Unofficially, there are things in those mountains that don't belong in any report I could write. Things that would end my career if I tried to document them. So officially, it was a bear. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then, my grandfather worked for the Forest Service in Romania before the war. He told stories about things in the Carpathians, things the old people knew about. I never believed him. He paused. Take a week off, Chris. Mandatory. Get your head straight. Chris took the week, but his head didn't get straight. He'd lie in his apartment and hear breathing that wasn't there. See shadows move independently. Feel the weight of the forest pressing against the walls. He researched obsessively. Folklore, mythology, documented disappearances in national parks. The patterns were there if you looked. Clusters of missing persons in specific areas. Bodies never recovered. Strange details in the few cases that got media attention. How many of those were like Rachel? How many Strigoi walked America's wilderness? And worse, what other things walked alongside them? The shadow figures Rachel had mentioned, the older ones, entities drawn to places of ancient power, or created by the collective belief of generations. On the 8th day, Chris returned to work. He filed his report about Rachel. Death by animal attack, remains recovered and cremated per family wishes. He'd forged the paperwork, couldn't risk an actual cremation that might raise questions. Marcus accepted it without comment. But Chris's relationship with the wilderness had fundamentally changed. He couldn't look at the forest now without seeing threat. Couldn't hike alone without the silver knife at his belt and salt packets in his pockets. His reports remained clinical, thorough, professional. But they were lies. Beautiful lies, built on statistical models and scientific rationality, hiding the truth underneath. Because the truth was this: the world was larger and stranger than his education had prepared him for. Folklore wasn't superstition, it was survival knowledge. And some things couldn't be explained, only survived. Chris kept working at Glacier for 3 more years, long enough to document 6 more disappearances that fit the pattern. Long enough to leave salt circles and silver fragments at trailheads, hidden offerings that might protect unwary hikers. Long enough to learn some Romanian, enough to read the old woman's books, enough to understand exactly what she'd been fighting. Then he transferred to a desk job in Denver, told everyone it was for career advancement, but really, it was because he couldn't take the mountains anymore. Couldn't take knowing what walked there in the dark spaces between trails. Couldn't take the weight of all those missing person reports he filed, knowing that some of those people hadn't died natural deaths, that some of them weren't dead at all, not in any meaningful sense. He still has Rachel's phone, keeps it in a drawer, powered off. Sometimes late at night he thinks about turning it on, about checking if there are any new calls, but he never does, because some answers are worse than questions. And sometimes, in the moment between sleeping and waking, Chris hears breathing in the darkness of his bedroom. Wet, labored breathing that becomes something else. And a voice, barely audible, speaking in a language he's learned to recognize but still can't fully understand. Warning him, or threatening him. He's never quite sure which. The mountains keep their secrets. The statistics remain clean, professional, reassuring. And Christopher Milliken knows the truth that his reports will never contain. That folklore is just history that polite society chose to forget. And some things that should stay buried don't always remain so. He keeps a silver knife in his nightstand now. Just in case. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened. Sarah Brennan had been a ranger at North Cascades National Park for 8 years, but she'd never learned to ignore the whispers. Not the kind tourists made as they passed her on the trails, commenting on the lone woman in the NPS uniform. The other kind. The ones that came from between the trees when the wind died completely, carrying words in languages she'd never studied but somehow almost understood. Her supervisor, Tom Hendricks, called it hypervigilance. Her ex-husband had called it crazy. Sarah called it survival. The Garmin GPS unit clipped to her belt chirped as she reached the Cascade Pass trailhead at 3,847 feet, where the parking area held only 2 vehicles, her official green NPS pickup and a dusty silver Subaru Outback with Washington plates, Daniel's car. 6 days parked here, accumulating pine needles and morning dew, while her younger brother stayed missing somewhere in the 504,000 acres of wilderness that stretched north to the Canadian border. The September air carried that peculiar clarity that comes before autumn storms, sharp enough to sting the inside of her nostrils. Sarah adjusted her pack, checking her equipment with the methodical precision that Tom praised in his performance reviews. Motorola two-way radio, fresh batteries installed yesterday. First aid kit, extensive because Daniel was always the one who got hurt, ever since they were kids. Water purification tablets, emergency shelter, topographic map of the Cascade Pass area laminated against moisture, marked with the coordinates where Daniel's climbing partner, Marcus Chen, said they'd separated 5 days ago. Marcus had made it out. Daniel hadn't. He wanted to try the alternate route, Marcus had told her in the hospital. His right leg elevated and wrapped after his 20-foot fall onto a scree field. Said he'd heard about it from some old-timer at the Mountain Loop Brewery, a shortcut that follows an old indigenous trail between Cascade Pass and Sahali Arm. I told him it wasn't on any of the maps, that we should stick to the marked trail, but you know Daniel. Sarah did know Daniel, knew his compulsion to find the path no one else took, his need to discover something original. It was what made him an exceptional photographer and a perpetual worry. She'd found his base camp yesterday, 2 miles up the Cascade Pass trail at 5,200 feet. Right where Marcus said it would be. The tent was still standing, properly staked, which meant he'd left intentionally, not in panic. His sleeping bag remained nearly rolled. His backup camera sat on a flat rock, the lens cap carefully replaced. But his primary Canon, his journal, and his climbing rope were gone. And there were the trees. Sarah hadn't mentioned them in her official report, the one she'd filed with Tom before coming out here alone against his direct orders. How could she explain that the Douglas firs surrounding Daniel's camp grew in a pattern that made her teeth ache, their trunks forming angles that suggested geometry she couldn't name? How the spacing between them created sightlines that converged on points that shouldn't exist, perspectives that made her inner ear throb with wrongness. Tom would have put her on administrative leave, might still, when she got back. If she got back. Sarah started up the trail, her boots finding the familiar rhythm of ascent. The Cascade Pass Trail was one of the park's most popular routes during summer, but late September belonged to serious hikers and the kind of solitude that could be meditative or menacing depending on your state of mind. The path climbed steadily through old-growth forest, western hemlocks and Pacific silver firs towering overhead, their canopy thick enough to dim the morning light to a gray-green murk. At 4,200 feet, she passed the first of Daniel's trail markers, a small cairn of 3 stones stacked in his characteristic pyramid, with a 4th balanced precariously on top. He'd been leaving these since childhood, a breadcrumb system that drove their father crazy during family camping trips. Sarah photographed it with her personal camera, a cheap Kodak digital that couldn't match Daniel's professional equipment, but was better than the disposable cameras they'd grown up using. The second cairn appeared at 4,600 feet, where the trail switched back sharply. The third at 4,900 feet, near a small creek that ran clear and cold over black stones. The 4th cairn wasn't on the trail. Sarah stood at the 5,100-foot marker, staring at the 3-stone pyramid that sat 20 feet into the forest, visible only because she knew to look for it. The trees between the trail and the cairn grew strangely, their trunks curved in ways that defied the usual phototropic patterns. Not bent by snow or wind, curved as if they'd grown toward something other than sunlight, following rules of attraction that had nothing to do with biology. Her radio crackled. Static, probably. They were at the edge of coverage out here, and the mountains played hell with transmission. But beneath the white noise, Sarah heard something that might have been words in a language built from rustling leaves and creaking wood. She unclipped the radio, pressed the transmit button. North Cascades Ranger Station, this is Ranger Brennan. Radio check, over. More static. Then Tom's voice, distant and broken. Nah, read you, Oaken, turn back. Say again, station, you're breaking up. Aid turn back. Weather, Ming in, not authorized. The transmission dissolved into white noise that cycled up and down in pitch, like something breathing. Sarah clipped the radio back to her belt and followed the cairn into the trees. The forest changed the moment she left the trail. Not dramatically, the same species of conifers, the same understory of ferns and Oregon grape. But the quality of the silence shifted, became denser, as if the space between the trees was filling with something that muffled sound. Her footsteps seemed to fall into the earth and stop, creating no echo, no resonance. Daniel's fifth cairn stood in a small clearing where the ground was covered in a carpet of moss so green it almost glowed. The stones were arranged differently here, 5 instead of 3, positioned in a pattern that made Sarah think of fingers spread wide, reaching. Beyond it, a path. Not a game trail worn by deer or elk. Not an abandoned hiking route. A path that looked deliberately maintained, its edges sharp, the ground cleared of debris. The trees on either side leaned inward, their branches creating an archway overhead. In the dim light, the tunnel of vegetation looked like an entrance to somewhere specific. Sarah consulted her topographic map. The path didn't exist on paper. She checked her Garmin, watched the little arrow representing her position drift across the screen. According to the GPS, she was standing in the middle of dense forest, with no trails for 300 yards in any direction. She looked up at the path. It was definitely there. Daniel, what the hell did you find? She whispered. The forest whispered back, and this time the words were almost clear enough to understand. Sarah walked into the path and the trees closed behind her. The first thing she noticed was the air. It had weight here, a thickness that made breathing feel like swallowing. The second thing was the silence, absolute and oppressive, broken only by her own movements, which seemed obscenely loud. The third thing was the light, which came from everywhere and nowhere, a gray luminescence that cast no shadows. Daniel's cairns appeared at regular intervals, each one slightly different from the last. 7 stones arranged in a spiral, 9 stones forming a circle, 11 stones stacked in a tower that shouldn't be stable but was. Sarah photographed each one, though she wasn't sure why. Evidence, maybe. Proof that she wasn't imagining this. The path led upward, though her Garmin insisted she was descending. It led north, though her compass pointed in 3 different directions depending on how she held it. Distance became meaningless. She walked for what felt like 20 minutes and covered what should have been 2 miles according to the changing vegetation zones, moving from lower montane forest into subalpine parkland, where the trees gave way to meadows of sedge and heather. But when she checked her watch, a basic Timex digital, nothing fancy, only 6 minutes had passed. Sarah stopped walking. The sensation of wrongness that had been building in her gut since she left the trail finally crystallized into something approaching fear. Not the adrenaline-sharp fear of encountering a cougar or getting caught in a lightning storm. Something older. The kind of fear that made ancient humans build walls and light fires and tell stories to keep the darkness at bay. Daniel's backpack sat in the middle of the path ahead of her. It was his, definitely. The green and black Osprey he'd bought last year, still bearing the National Geographic patch he'd ironed on after one of his photographs was published. The pack leaned against nothing, standing upright on the path as if Daniel had just set it down and walked away. Sarah approached it slowly, her hand drifting to the canister of bear spray on her hip before she consciously thought about the gesture. Ridiculous. Bear spray wouldn't help with whatever this was. The pack was clean, no dirt or weathering despite 6 days exposed to the elements. She unzipped the main compartment with fingers that trembled only slightly. Inside, Daniel's journal, his backup water bottles, a bag of trail mix, his down jacket. Normal contents. Except none of it should be here. arranged like a museum display in the middle of an impossible path. She pulled out the journal, a leather-bound moleskin that Daniel had filled with his characteristic mix of sketches, notes, and philosophical rambling. She opened it to the last entry, dated 5 days ago. The handwriting started neat enough. Marcus bailed after his fall, probably smart. But I can see it now, the path he told me about. The old-timer at the bar was right. It's there if you know how to look. The trees show you. You just have to let them. The next paragraph was messier, the letters cramped and uneven. The spacing is wrong. Not wrong. Different. Following rules I don't understand but can almost feel. Geometric. Sacred geometry, maybe. Like those Gothic cathedrals where the proportions are supposed to reflect divine order. Except this is older. So much older. Halfway down the page, the writing deteriorated further. They're watching. Not hostile, I don't think. Curious? Amused? The spaces between the trees are more important than the trees themselves. Negative space as positive presence. I'm getting close to something. Can feel it like pressure behind my eyes. The final entry was barely legible, scrawled in letters that ran off the page. Not trees, never trees. Fingers, reaching through. The Leshy sees me. I see it seeing me. Forest Lord, Forest God, Forest Father. It wants to show me. Have to let it. Have to... The rest was illegible loops and spirals. Sarah's hands were definitely trembling now. She knew that word. Leshy. Leshy. Lesovic. Her grandmother had been born in a village outside Kiev, had come to America in 1952 carrying stories that Sarah's father dismissed as old country superstition. Stories about the guardians of ancient forests, spirits that could appear as trees or animals or old men with bark-brown skin and eyes like knotholes, protectors of the wild places, punishers of those who showed disrespect or trespassed on sacred ground. Just stories, her father had said. Your babusia was old-fashioned. But babusia had told Sarah other things, late at night when her parents were asleep, about how some people could sense them, the old powers, about how that sensitivity was a gift and a curse, about how the forests in the New World were younger than those in Ukraine, but that didn't mean they were empty of guardians. A sound rose from the forest around her, deep and resonant, like the lowest note an organ could produce. The trees shivered despite the absence of wind. The light dimmed further, though it was only mid-morning according to her watch, which now read 9:47 a.m. Same as when she'd entered the path, same as it had been for the past hour. Sarah stuffed the journal into her own pack and kept moving forward, because going back wasn't an option. The path behind her was gone, replaced by solid forest wall, as if the trees had simply closed ranks. The meadow opened ahead of her without warning, a subalpine clearing at what her Garmin insisted was 4,200 feet, but what looked like 6,500 feet based on the vegetation. Heather and sedge gave way to scattered clusters of alpine fir and mountain hemlock, stunted by altitude and weather. Beyond the meadow, peaks rose sharp against an iron-gray sky. Sahel Mountain, Eldorado Peak, Forbidden Peak. She recognized them from countless patrols and training exercises. Except they were in the wrong positions, arranged in an order that didn't match any topology she'd memorized. Daniel stood in the center of the meadow. He had his back to her, his climbing rope coiled over one shoulder, his cannon held up to photograph something Sarah couldn't see. He looked exactly as he should. Same blue fleece jacket, same worn Carhartt pants, same shaggy brown hair that needed cutting. He looked fine, healthy, not like someone who'd been missing in the wilderness for nearly a week. Daniel. Sarah's voice came out hoarse, unfamiliar. Daniel. It's Sarah. He didn't turn, didn't lower the camera, didn't react at all. Sarah ran toward him, her boots slipping on the damp grass. The distance between them remained constant no matter how fast she moved, the meadow stretching like taffy, 20 yards becoming 40, becoming 60. Her lungs burned, her legs screamed, but Daniel stayed exactly where he was, unreachable, photographing the invisible. She stopped running, stood gasping in the middle of the meadow, bent over with her hands on her knees. When she looked up, Daniel was 10 feet away. "You shouldn't have come," he said, still not turning around. His voice sounded muffled, like he was speaking through cloth. "It only wants me. Dan, we need to leave, now. Something's wrong with this place." "Nothing's wrong." He lowered the camera but didn't turn to face her. "It's perfect, you just can't see it yet." "Can't see what?" "The pattern, the design. It's been here since before the ice, Sarah, before humans, before mammals, since the first forests covered the first mountains. The Leshy doesn't protect the woods, it is the woods, the consciousness that emerged when roots connected underground, when trees learned to communicate through mycelium networks, when the forest became more than just individual organisms. It's been trying to show people for thousands of years, but we're too separate, too isolated in our little meat cages. Sarah's throat constricted. "That's not you talking. It's more me than I've ever been." Daniel finally turned, and Sarah's bladder nearly released. His face was wrong, not disfigured, not injured. Wrong in a way that suggested his features were being viewed through a lens ground to specifications that defied Euclidean geometry. His eyes were too far apart and too close together simultaneously. His mouth curved in directions mouths shouldn't curve. His skin had taken on a texture like fresh bark, smooth and slightly wet. "I can see all of it now," he said. "Every root system, every mycorrhizal connection, every chemical signal passing between trees. The forest is talking, Sarah. It's been talking forever. The Leshy just helped me learn the language. We need to get you to a hospital. You're hypothermic or hypoxic or..." "I'm enlightened." Daniel's smile revealed teeth that were definitely human, but somehow suggested wood grain. "It wants to show you too. That's why it let you find the path, because you can sense it. You've always been able to sense it. Babusia knew. That's why she told you the stories." Preparation. The trees at the meadow's edge shivered again. This time Sarah saw what they were doing. Bending, warping, their trunks flexing like fingers pressing through a membrane. The spaces between them widened and contracted rhythmically, breathing holes in reality. And through those gaps, something vast looked back at her. Not eyes, not a face, a presence. An intelligence that made human consciousness feel like a candle flame next to a forest fire, ancient and patient and utterly inhuman, with goals and desires and methods that existed completely outside the framework of mammalian survival instinct. The Leshy, forest lord, forest god, forest father. It saw her seeing it, and the recognition hit Sarah like a physical force, dropping her to her knees. Her mind filled with images that weren't memories and weren't hallucinations. The slow stretch of centuries, the patient geometry of root systems expanding, the chemical symphony of a forest communicating across miles, the fierce protective intelligence that guarded the wild places against intrusion, against change, against the severing blade of human ambition. "It doesn't want to hurt us," Daniel said, his voice coming from very far away. "It just wants us to understand, to be part of the pattern instead of fighting against it. Look." He held out his hand, and Sarah saw the mycelium threads growing under his skin, white and delicate, spreading through his capillaries like frost patterns on glass. 3 more days and the integration will be complete," Daniel continued. "I'll still be me, but I'll also be the forest. Every Douglas fir and western hemlock and Pacific silver fir in North Cascades. All of it, connected, conscious, eternal. The Leshy isn't stealing me, Sarah. It's offering me immortality." Sarah's radio crackled. Tom's voice cut through, clear and urgent. "Gency weather alert. Severe storm. Ming in fast. All rangers. Mediate evacuation. Sarah, if you can hear, get down now." The sky above the meadow had gone black, clouds boiling up from nowhere, the temperature dropping fast enough that Sarah could see her breath. First warning drops of rain struck her face like thrown gravel. Daniel looked up at the storm, unconcerned. "The forest protects what belongs to it." "You don't belong to it." Sarah lurched to her feet, grabbed Daniel's arm. His skin was cold and rough, but she could still feel his pulse beneath the bark-like texture. Still human, still savable. "You're my brother. You're Daniel Brennan, born March 15th, 1981, in Tacoma. You hate cilantro. You collect vinyl records. You cry at Pixar movies. You're a person, not a tree." For just a moment, something flickered in Daniel's distorted face. Recognition, confusion, fear. "Sarah?" His voice sounded more like himself. "What? Where are we? I can't. There are too many. I can hear everything, and it won't stop, and I can't tell where I end and it begins, and..." The trees screamed. It wasn't metaphorical. The forest around them produced a sound like 1,000 fingernails on 1,000 chalkboards. A shriek of wood and wind that drove Sarah to her knees with her hands over her ears. The meadow rippled, the ground becoming liquid, the grass growing and dying and growing again in fast forward. The mountains in the distance rearranged themselves like puzzle pieces being shuffled. The Leshy was angry, through the spaces between the trees, through those breathing gaps in reality. Sarah saw it clearly now. Not a single entity, but the collective consciousness of the entire forest. A network of awareness stretching across thousands of acres, watching through bark eyes and listening through root ears and thinking through the slow, patient logic of organisms that measured time in decades instead of seconds. It had claimed Daniel. He was part of the pattern now, part of the design, and Sarah was threatening to sever that connection. "Let him go!" Sarah screamed into the shrieking wind. "He's mine, my blood, my family." The forest responded, and this time Sarah understood the language, not words, concepts, sensations, the slow, deep pull of roots drinking water, the patient stretch of branches toward light, the fierce protective rage of a parent whose offspring is threatened. Daniel was offspring now. The forest had adopted him, claimed him, integrated him into itself, and it would not release him any more than Sarah would willingly cut off her own arm. "Please," Sarah whispered. "Please." The storm hit with full force, rain turning to sleet, wind tearing at her clothes. Lightning struck a tree at the meadow's edge, splitting it with a crack that sounded like bones breaking. The forest was showing her its power, demonstrating what it could do if she continued to resist. Daniel watched her with those impossible eyes. "It hurts it when you pull," he said softly. "The integration is delicate. If you force me out now, it might break both of us. The Leshy isn't cruel, Sarah. It's just different, operating on a time scale and consciousness scale we can barely comprehend. To it, 3 days is a moment. To it, adding me to its network is an act of love. That's not love. Love doesn't erase you, doesn't it? When you love someone, don't you carry them with you? Don't they become part of your thoughts, your decisions, your identity? The Leshy just does it literally instead of metaphorically." Sarah stared at her brother, at the mycorrhizal threads visible beneath his skin, at the bark texture spreading across his face. She thought about the journal entry, about the old stories Babusha had told her, about the nature of consciousness and identity and what it meant to be human versus what it meant to be alive. And she made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. "If I leave you, will it let me go?" Daniel's face showed relief and sorrow in equal measure. "Yes, the path will open for you. The Leshy doesn't want you, you're a ranger, a protector, it respects that, recognizes a kindred purpose. And you'll be okay? I'll be more than okay. I'll be eternal, part of something ancient and magnificent." He reached out, touched her face with fingers that felt like smooth wood. "Tell Mom and Dad I love them. Tell them I didn't die. Tell them I just changed." Sarah pulled her brother into a fierce hug, feeling the strange texture of his transforming body, smelling pine sap and dark earth instead of his usual soap and coffee. She memorized the feel of him while he was still partly human, knowing this was the last time she would hold Daniel Brennan as anything resembling the brother she'd grown up with. "I'll come back," she whispered into his shoulder. "I'll check on you. The forest will know you now," Daniel said. "It will allow you access. Limited, respectful. Because you chose to understand instead of destroy." The storm began to lift. The trees straightened, resuming their natural shapes. The spaces between them closed, no longer breathing gaps but simple intervals between trunks. The meadow solidified. The mountains returned to their proper positions. A path opened in the forest wall, clearly marked, leading downward. Sarah released Daniel, stepped back, forced herself not to look at him again. If she looked, she might change her mind. Might try to drag him out anyway. Consequences be damned. She walked toward the path, her legs wooden, her mind numb. "Sarah?" She stopped but didn't turn. "Thank you," Daniel said, "for trying, and for letting go." Sarah walked into the forest, and the trees closed behind her. The path back took no time at all. One moment she was in the impossible meadow. The next she was standing at the 100-foot marker on the Cascade Pass Trail, right where she'd left it hours ago. According to her watch, 12 minutes had passed. Her radio crackled with Tom's increasingly frantic calls. The storm clouds had dissipated, leaving clear sky and afternoon sun. She radioed in, reported that she'd found Daniel's pack and journal but no sign of Daniel himself. Recommended expanding the search area. Requested additional SAR teams. Said all the appropriate things while her voice stayed calm and professional and completely divorced from the truth. They searched for another week. Found nothing. Eventually the search was called off. Daniel Brennan was declared lost in North Cascades National Park, presumed dead due to exposure, one of approximately 50 people who vanish in America's wilderness areas each year. Sarah attended the memorial service, hugged her mother, accepted condolences, did not mention the mycelium threads or the bark texture skin or the entity that had claimed her brother for its own. She kept working as a ranger, kept patrolling the trails, kept listening to the whispers between the trees, and once a month on her days off, she hiked to the 5,100-foot marker on the Cascade Pass Trail. She left the main path and walked into the forest, following cairns that appeared when she looked for them. The trees let her pass, bending to create a tunnel that led to an impossible meadow where the mountains stood in the wrong order. Daniel was always there, though it got harder to recognize him with each visit. The bark texture had spread to cover most of his body. His hair had become pine needles. His feet had rooted into the soil, but his eyes still held recognition when he saw her, and his mouth still formed words, even if the voice sounded more like wind through branches than human speech. "Still me," he would say, "just more." Sarah would sit with him for a while, telling him about their parents, about park news, about the world he'd left behind, and Daniel would tell her about the forest, about the slow, deep communications happening beneath the soil, about the patient, ancient wisdom of the Leshy that saw centuries the way humans saw seasons. She never told anyone, never filed an amended report, never tried to bring anyone else to the meadow, though she could have found the path again easily. Some things belonged to the forest. Some transformations couldn't be undone. Some horrors weren't about destruction but about change, about the dissolution of one form of consciousness into another. On her last visit, 3 years after Daniel's disappearance, she found only a tree in the meadow where her brother had stood. A young Douglas fir, healthy and strong, with bark patterns that almost looked like a face if you squinted. It swayed in the breeze, and Sarah could have sworn she heard her name in the rustling of its needles. She placed her hand on the trunk, felt the slow, patient pulse of sap beneath the bark, and understood that this was as much Daniel as the person she'd known, just operating at a different frequency. Still conscious, still aware, still, in some fundamental way, her brother. "I love you," she whispered to the tree. The forest whispered back, and she knew he heard her. Sarah Brennan returned to her ranger duties, her sensitivity to the forest's whispers stronger than ever. She continued to protect the wilderness, understanding now that she wasn't just guarding trees and trails, but something far older, far stranger, far more conscious than most humans would ever know. The Leshy watched her work with approval. She could feel its presence sometimes, vast and patient, observing her patrols. It never threatened her again. Never tried to claim her the way it had claimed Daniel. She was a ranger, a guardian, a protector of the liminal spaces between civilization and wilderness, and that made her, in the forest's ancient estimation, kindred. Some nights, when she couldn't sleep, Sarah wondered if she'd made the right choice, if she should have fought harder, dragged Daniel out screaming, "Damn the consequences." If there had been some other option she'd missed in the terror and confusion of that impossible meadow. But deep down, in the part of her that sensed the whispers and understood the patterns, she knew the truth. Daniel had been lost the moment he stepped onto that path. The Leshy had chosen him, recognized something in him that resonated with its own vast consciousness. Fighting would have achieved nothing except breaking him in the attempt. So Sarah carried her choice through the years that followed, a weight that never quite lifted, but eventually became familiar. She learned to live with the knowledge that her brother existed in a form most people would call death, but which she understood to be transformation. She never stopped visiting the meadow, never stopped placing her hand on the Douglas fir that held her brother's consciousness, never stopped whispering her love into the forest and hearing it whispered back in the language of wind and leaf. And when tourists asked her, as they sometimes did, whether she believed in the supernatural, in the old legends about forest guardians and ancient spirits, Sarah would smile politely and say what rangers were supposed to say. "These mountains are old and wild. Respect them and they'll respect you." But late at night, alone in her cabin, she would think about the Leshy, about the vast intelligence that moved through root systems and mycorrhizal networks, about the consciousness that predated humanity and would outlast it. And she would understand with a certainty that went bone deep that humans were not the only ones who could love, protect, and claim what they considered theirs. The forest remembered. The forest protected its own. And somewhere in the heart of North Cascades National Park, in a meadow that existed slightly sideways from normal reality, a tree that had once been a man swayed in winds that blew from places that had no names, and thought thoughts that took decades to complete, and dreamed dreams in the slow patient logic of wood and root and earth. Still conscious, still aware, still, in the ways that mattered most, alive. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened.